When trust breaks down between human communities, that's one of the times when vices will really flourish.
So you seem like you're in a time where trust has broken down. Just from the outside. I don't know how it is on the ground, but it seems like things have fallen apart a little bit.
Yes, many human societies right now have quite profound problems of trust. Sometimes it's a loss of trust in specific people, like our leaders. Sometimes it's a breakdown in trust between different social or religious or ethnic groups. It's driven by phenomena like polarization, where people voice increasingly extreme beliefs in order to distinguish themselves from other groups. So we have big problems with breakdowns of trust between individuals, cultures, institutions. Sometimes this is because of accidental events like crises. Sometimes it's because there are some people working to create distrust for their own purposes, for example, to
Hmm.
divide communities and set people against one another. But we do have big problems of trust. There are still certain people in professions that we trust, but we are struggling with trust right now. And that's part of lots and lots of our problems.
It seems like, in response to a lot of this distrust, very popular media circulates, very popular opinions concern essentially a enemy misanthropic stance, which is sort of like the alternative to X, Y, and Z structures is to burn them to the ground.
Everything is so corrupt that it must be destroyed. That type of thing.
Yeah, I wonder if you, being not an enemy of humanity, are concerned about the tendency of individuals to promote the enemy platform and how those individuals can be perhaps, I don't want to say manipulated, but
Ha!
pulled back into some of the more productive misanthropies.
Well, you're right to see connections between some forms of misanthropy, like the enemy form, and certain horrible attitudes on earth. Um, Attitudes like racism, sexism, Islamophobia. There's a nice example of this actually. In the 1980s, about 3 decades ago on Earth, there was a group of eco misanthropes. And they described themselves as misanthropes and they said humankind is awful. We need to disrupt human beings. We need to dismantle our industrial systems, our economic systems, because human beings are so atrocious and we destroy the planet. But if you look at their writings and their remarks, it's clear that it's not humankind they wanted to destroy. It wasn't all human beings they wanted to get rid of. It was only specific human beings.
Hmm.
So, for instance, they said we should allow famines to flourish in Africa, one of our continents. Now, that won't reduce the human population, it will reduce the African population. So, to me, that's not misanthropic because it's not aimed at humankind, it's racist, it's aimed at Africans. Similarly, they said we should allow a horrible virus called HIV to spread in various world countries. We shouldn't treat it or put any resources into it. But again, that's not misanthropic, that's homophobic, because the intended victims are not all human beings, but specific groups of human beings. And this is a case of people who walk and talk like misanthropes, but really they're not. They're homophobes, they're sexists, they're racists. But there are important connections because the attitudes and behaviors are similar. There's the encouragement to violence. There's the incitement to see other people as your enemies and your opponents. There's the policies of violence and destruction. And that's one reason that I don't like the enemy stance. It's too close to various awful things that human beings are capable of. And that's why you should always pull away from the enemy stance. Fundamentally, it motivates violence. And we have enough of that in the world. That's why I would want to lean towards the activist or the quietist stance, because they try not to do any harm in the world. Quite the opposite.
Do you have
And I think
any?
you can give,
Go ahead, sorry.
and I think you can give people good reasons to want to adopt the other misanthropic stances.
Yeah,
You
that's what
know,
I was going to ask.
yeah. Well, I think for one thing, it's just nicer. I think if your life is not dominated by violence and hatred, there are better ways to live as a human being.
Well, there's some people that seem like they need that, though, right? Because there always used to be a class of people that were in the military, or that were fighting wars, or that were actively violent in the world. And say what you will about human development, there do seem to be less people in standing armies that are waiting at the gates of foreign cities. And so those people are now just distributed throughout society. And they probably catch on to that mindset quite quickly, and they probably want the violence and the hatred and the anger in their lives.
Well, this is a question that some of those optimistic people I described discuss. So I mentioned this fellow Rutger Bregman. Now, in his book, he offers lots of very interesting scientific research which suggests that actually it's very, very difficult to make human beings commit violence towards other human beings. So he gives this very interesting evidence from the history of warfare, which suggests that actually most human beings in warfare don't actually fire at the enemy. They don't use weapons that we call bows and guns. They either don't fire or they shoot over the heads of their enemies. And he says, well, this says something good about human beings. It's very, very difficult to make us violent towards our fellow kind. You have to do a lot to people. You have to brutalize them. You have to train them in certain ways. Now, that's a very attractive story, and I really, really hope it's true. But of course, one problem is that if you look over the history of our military technology, we've also become extremely good at finding ways to overcome this natural resistance. And if you look at our societies more widely right now, it's clear that even if people are naturally resistant to hating their fellow human beings, there are very, very effective ways to make people hate other human beings. For example, there are ways to marginalize other human beings, to mark them out as vermin, as dirty, as corrupted, as dangerous, as criminalistic. And unfortunately, even if people resist violence and hatred, we are very, very skilled, some of us anyway, at making people hateful and violent.
And there seems to be an epidemic of that going on in parallel with the pandemic, right? And there seem to be two camps that are breaking down. One camp that feels strongly about the necessity of lockdowns, and the other camp that feels strongly about, well, open everything back up, and who dies, dies.
Yes. And that's a good example of the misanthrope's claim that it takes very, very little to tip human beings over into their vices. So one claim that misanthropes make is that even if a lot of the time human beings behave in a more or less okay way, it takes very, very little to reveal their violence, selfishness, and so on. Just put them into disrupted conditions, deprive them of certain things, introduce fear and anxiety, and people will tend to act quite badly. And I suppose the current pandemic situation that we're going through is an example of this. In the early days of the pandemic, at least in the country that I live in, there's lots of very optimistic talk of a moral transformation, of people becoming friendlier and more neighborly, looking out for one another, community groups springing into action. And it was all very encouraging. And to a degree, it was true. But at the same time, there's been lots of negative behavior as well. So, for example, people moved quite easily from looking out for their neighbors to seeing if their neighbors conform to various social measures, seeing if they participate in the new social rituals like applauding healthcare workers. There are lots of people who became very, very complacent quite quickly. There are lots of people who, in their intellectual responses, have become quite dogmatic and closed-minded, jumping to conclusions, not asking certain questions. And this is partly because it's a very, very difficult time, and it's very difficult for people to be at their best morally under these sorts of difficult conditions. When they're suffering grief and uncertainty and loss and disruption, these are hard times. And it's wrong to condemn people for their failings under such difficult circumstances. But still, it's always going to be the case that we have to respond to these problems at a certain point. So again, in the country I live in, there is a big debate, as you said, about lockdown. And one difficult aspect of this situation is that lockdown, our measure to control it, is possibly doing just as much damage, actually, as this COVID virus is. So the virus is very, very sadly killing people. It has a death rate, and that's very, very sad. But at the same time, lockdown has a whole range of very negative effects. It's disrupting people's mental health, their sense of security. It's affecting their jobs, their employment, their sense of their future, their ability to plan, their education. It's affecting their emotional lives. It affects the development of their children. And there comes a point when you have to have a difficult conversation and ask, are these measures proportional to the risks? And it's quite difficult to have those conversations because a response of many people is, if you ask that question, then you're being cold and callous and calculating. But it's an important question to ask. because arguably now at this point, the lockdown measures are causing much more disruption and violence and harm than the virus itself. And when your control measures are doing more damage than the thing you're trying to control, then you need to have those very difficult conversations. But difficult conversations amongst human beings typically generate vices. People become defensive and anxious and aggressive. And sometimes you just have to face that head on.